When I first started shooting weddings, receptions, anytime I was using a flash indoors were the times that I felt most self-conscious about my photos. When it came to putting a flash on my camera, I just felt like, all right, well, I guess we'll just try my best and see what happens. This is the video that I wish I watched back then so I would knew what the heck to do when I was shooting with flash at weddings.
Yeah.
Before we get started, if you find this video is helpful, I put together a kind of a cheat sheet for you that you can print off, take with you on a wedding day, put it in your camera bag, and it will help you get the shots that you want when you feel maybe a little bit overwhelmed at a wedding and you're like, oh no, what should I do? There's a link for you to be able to download it in the description. First of all, there are 3 things that you need to know that you need to keep in mind as you're shooting at receptions during a wedding. The first thing is keep it natural. Don't get too intense. Don't get too excited with using flashes. I always try to use flash in a way where it doesn't seem obvious that you're using flash. And I think that's kind of the best way to use it. The second thing is keep it simple. I know as photographers, our kind of gut reaction is to like, when in doubt, add gear. Just like keep adding more and more gear, which I know I love to do that. But I think it's so important to keep things simple. For a wedding day, I have one flash. I have this one Godox V1 flash that I used. I actually did a review on this flash if you're interested in looking at it. But I have this and then I have a backup version, but I only use one flash at a time. In fact, my whole kind of like flash gear, I have just a pretty simple light stand that I use sometimes. I have this Godox radio trigger and then a pretty cheap, this is the brand Neewer video light that I just got from Amazon. And for most of the time, I'm just using my flash mounted right on the top of my camera. And that's it. It doesn't have to be complicated in order to get really beautiful images. The third thing I want you to keep in mind to use your camera and flash on full manual while you're trying to figure out how to use this or how to best incorporate it into your style. I think tools like TTL are really helpful and they can be great and helpful. However, unless you have a really good grasp on how flash and ambient light and your settings work, I would stick to using full manual mode on everything, even though it feels tedious. And at the beginning, you're gonna be like, oh, this is horrible. But trust me, start with manual. Okay, so now I'm gonna walk you through how I set up my camera and my flash. The first important question you need to ask yourself when setting up your camera, when setting up the flashes is, what do you wanna do with the ambient light and what do you wanna do with the flash? This is kind of, I feel like so many photographers skip over this question and this thought, but it's so fundamental in understanding how flash photography works and how to actually get your camera and flash to do what you want it to do. I always like to have a lot of the available light because I'm going for a natural look. I think of flash as kind of this addition, this way to kind of clean up your photo, to add this pop of nice white, clean light to make things maybe look a little, yes, yellow or dingy, especially when you're dealing with indoor lighting. So when I'm setting up my camera, I forget about the flash for a second and focus on the available light and those settings. The first thing that I do is set up my ISO. So right now I have my ISO at 200. So this is a nice dark room. And so I'm gonna put this up to 800. So I have a lot of available light. I like how my lamp is kind of like glowing right now. The second step for me is the aperture. And when I think of aperture, I primarily think about it as the depth of field. So I don't primarily use it to make my photo brighter or darker. I like a nice shallow depth of field, so I like shooting at 1.2. I like shooting at 2.0. So for this scenario, and during a reception, I often shoot at something like 2.0 or 2.8. So let's put it up to 2.8. Okay. Now, when we did that, we got a little darker. And I like the glow of the lamp so far. Okay, that's great. The next thing I do is shutter speed. Unless you're using high-speed sync, you need to keep your shutter speed at 1/200th, around that, depending on your camera, or below that. Otherwise, you need to use, if you want a faster shutter speed, you have to use high-speed sync, which is a different video. But shutter speed doesn't affect the power of your flash. And this is a little bit of a brain teaser that kind of messes with you because you're so used to using the shutter speed to change exposure. But when it deals with flash, the flash is just one burst of light, and your shutter speed doesn't change that power of that light. It only affects your available light. So when you're using flash, you can use really low shutter speeds in order to get some of that ambient light. And if your flash is hitting your subject, you're not gonna have a blurry photo, too much of a blurry photo. You can actually have your shutter speed at like 1/10 of a second and still get a sharp photo, because when you turn a flash on and it hits your subject, it freezes it. And that's how you get that light dragging effect, where your shutter speed is pretty low, it's focused on that available light, you have some dragging lights in the background, but the subject, which has the flash on it, is still nice and sharp. So for this scenario, we're going to bring the shutter speed down a little bit. I'll have it at 1/60th. Okay, and before I put my flash on, I'm just gonna take a shot here so we can compare the difference between flash and no flash. Okay, so I've got my flash here. I'm gonna put it on the top of my camera. I'm gonna aim it behind me and to the side a little bit. I'm gonna turn it on. And what I normally do when I'm setting up a scenario where I want to use flash, I start by, of course, putting it on manual, and then I put it to the very lowest. For this flash, it goes down to 1/256th of the power, of a full power. Okay, so now I'm gonna take a photo with that, and the result is actually pretty nice. And that's kind of what I was looking for. For sake of example, let's move it up I'm gonna move it up to 1/64. So that's a pretty big jump. And the difference between that is much, much cleaner. I have a much cleaner look, and I still have the glow of the lamp. So you can use this exact type of setup when you're getting ready for a reception to get that balance of like that warm candlelight on the tables, as well as cleaning up your subjects with a nice fill of flash. But what if you don't want a lot of ambient light? What if you want to get rid of that ambient light and you want to have most of the light coming from your flash? Well, I always do it the same way. I start by setting it with my ambient light. So in this scenario, let's move our ISO way down. Let's move it down to like 200, okay? The aperture, I still want it at 2.8. I still want that kind of like shallow depth of field. This time, let's put our shutter speed up, but we already have it now at 200, and I don't want to do high-speed sync, so we're gonna keep it at 200. So this is a scenario. Let's move the ISO down a little further. Okay, we're at 100, but I want it darker. I want less of that globe. So that's when we're gonna move our aperture. Let's move it way up. Let's keep going. Let's keep going. Okay, there, F10. All my ambient light is gone. And if I were to take a picture, you would just have just a little bit of light coming through. So now let's see what happens when I add my flash. I turn it on, and I'm gonna take a photo at the same power that I had before, 1/64. Okay, and when I look at that photo, it just adds like a little bit of flashlight, not much at all. So in order to use the flash and make the photo just be the light from the flash, I'm gonna do all the way up to a half power. That's the huge difference. And it really looks like I'm gonna have to use full power on this flash in order to properly kind of light this photo. And so that is the full power flash and kind of getting rid of all the ambient light that I can. So how do you take those settings and apply those to actually using them within a wedding day? I would say there's kind of 4 styles of flash that I use, or kind of assistant lighting that I use throughout the wedding day. The first one I'm calling is just like the natural light look. This is how I shoot 80, 90% of flash coverage at a wedding day. This is what it looks like. What I'm doing for all of these scenarios is Yes, I'm starting off my lighting to get the ambient light because I want a little bit of this candle light here. And then what I'm doing is adding this fill of flash. And how I get this natural look is by bouncing the light off the ceiling and the wall. I made a whole video about how to do this and more detail into bouncing lights. I'm gonna link it here if you wanna watch that video. Here's a look where it's not like super natural looking, but it looks clean. It's not like dingy like so many receptions and dark scenarios can look very quickly. And for the most part, I'm getting a good amount of light pulled from the ambient light, and then I'm filling it with this flash. Now, the next 3 photos that I show you, to me, are what makes using flash in this natural way really exciting, because you can't tell that that you're using a lot of flash. So here's a scenario where the room was so dark and it was so dingy. The florals were beautiful, the tablescapes were beautiful, and I was just like, there's got to be a way to make it look like there's just gorgeous natural light coming through a window. But instead, I used flash. For this scenario, what I did was I fired flash low and strong, and I used the zoom function on my zoom so that it would focus all the light in kind of one area and make it feel like it was coming from a window. And so here you have these scenarios where, like, if I didn't use flash for these photos, it would be a completely different game altogether. And so here you can clearly tell I actually bounced the flash directly at an existing window. There wasn't enough light coming in. And so I kind of amped it up by having my flash right on my camera and then aiming it at a window to enhance that like natural look. Something that's important in these scenarios is to balance that ambient light and the flash. Because if you don't balance out those things and you don't have enough ambient light coming in, that's when it makes it look very flashy. Now, I told you for the most part, my camera is mounted on top of my flash and I'm doing a bounce type of scenario. This scenario for speeches specifically is a time that I actually mount my flash on a light stand and connect it with a radio trigger on my camera. And this is a great example of how I use this. What I do is I leave the flash in one area and bounce the flash on a wall or a part of the ceiling, and I just leave it there. And then I'm able to go around and shoot different photos of the speeches, the reactions to the speeches and all of that. I still get that kind of very natural looking light, but it's consistent. And I kind of hate, like having the flash on top of the camera. It's heavy. Then you're like pointing it in guest's face. And especially during speeches, I find it's a lot less distracting. A lot less guests get flashed in the eye from having my flash on my camera. The next type of style and flash that I use is direct video light. It's not even a flash at all. But what it's this video light right here that's small and compact. And I use it to have a little bit more of a direct, harsher look of light, but it's always very subtle. This is a perfect example of that. This photo is mostly using ambient light. However, you can see this kind of outline of this light coming from the side. It's not this huge blast of light where you're seeing just like looks like a car is coming to hit this couple. No, it's just a little bit of harsh light coming from the corner to kind of separate them from, their guests, their family around them, watching them dance. And this is what I use this. I put this on a tripod. I have a little elbow that helps me, angle it exactly where I want it to go. But I love using this for first dances and sometimes cake cutting, where I want just like a little bit of harsh light, but it doesn't look like there's kind of a train coming for them. I really never do those type of harsh accent lights. I see that all the time where they set up a flash and it kind of points it out to the camera and it highlights the couple. I think it's a certain look, but I don't use that look when shooting weddings. I also use this video light in scenarios where I don't want kind of a burst of a flash, where I find it kind of distracting. And that's in scenarios like this, where the bride's getting ready. I don't really want just like a pop, pop, pop all the time. And so in that scenario, I just turn this thing on, bounce it into the ceiling, into kind of a corner, and it adds just a little bit of extra light, a little bit of extra cleanness to get photos like this. For the same wedding day, I actually used it for the groom. He was getting ready in this really dark library where everything was dark wood. And what I did was I bounced this off the little bit of white that I could find in the room. And that added so much. Otherwise, it was just gonna be very dark and muddy. And so this thing saved my butt in order to be able to get a really nice, clean portraits of this groom getting ready. Oh, and here is one example of using this video flash, on the dance floor. You can actually, I don't often do this, but I found a photo of this actually on the stand. So you can see here, it is right there on the dance floor. It's adding a little bit of light, a little bit of interest to this dance photo, which I think is pretty fun. And for this photo, that light is still there on that tripod, but I turned it way, way, way down. So you can see the little bit of glisten on her hair. I just wanted a little bit more dimension. And a lot of this lighting is coming from the DJs, it's coming from the candles. And then I just wanted a little bit of clean light coming down. The next way that I use flashes, and I don't do this a lot, but I do like using it almost at every wedding to kind of give it a little bit of an accent, and that is with direct flash. So here's a scenario where I have my flash either on the top of my camera or I hold it in my hand like this and I use a radio trigger, just because I like having some different angles so it's not just always, coming from right above the camera. This is that scenario where I talked about earlier where my shutter speed was very slow, and that gives those kind of light drags that you see. However, because my flash was pretty strong and pretty powerful, it froze everybody else. So it was a nice kind of crisp, hand, nice crisp drink, but then you had some kind of movement in the background. In general, I like using these for some portraits. This fun portrait of this groom holding his Stanley Cup with him. And it just gives this different level of mood and energy that you don't get with that very soft kind of indirect lighting. I've talked about this photo on a different video, one of my favorite photos from last year's receptions. But it adds a lot of fun. It definitely adds a lot of dance vibe. The last way that I use flash is I don't use it at all. When I was starting out in weddings, I just had this idea that if you're at a reception, if it's dark, you've got to use flash. And I had this realization, especially as I got better and better cameras, and especially I've talked about this camera a lot and I love it, but the Z6 II is really great in low light. And so many cameras are so great at low light. And so you don't have to use flash all the time. You can jack that ISO and get really beautiful images. You can use the lighting that's already around you and get really beautiful images. All of these images, I'm not using flash. I'm not using any type of different lighting. And it's so beautiful. Like, yes, it adds a lot of grain, but I like kind of the grittiness. Some of these scenarios I'm shooting on, grainy film. So that's quite literally grain that I'm looking for and paying for. But here is your permission. Permission granted to jack that ISO and get some really fun portraits with no flash at all. And that's the easiest way to use flash.